Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into, well, the really complex and fast-moving situation in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. We're focusing on key developments as we see them around June 2025.
Right, and we've gone through a stack of your sources, military analysis, economic reports, diplomatic chatter, you name it, to try and pull out the most important bits for you.
Exactly. Our mission, like always, is to cut through all the noise and give you a clear, informed picture of what's actually happening, both on the ground and, behind the scenes. So let's get started.
Sounds good.
Let's begin right on the front lines. It's this constantly shifting map, isn't it? Every bit of ground gained or lost costs so much. What's the latest telling us about who might have the upper hand, particularly in places like Sumy Oblast? We've heard a lot about that recently.
Yeah, Sumy's been key. And one really striking detail came from the Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrskyi around June 26th. He actually stated that Ukraine has halted Russia's advance in Sumy Oblast.
Halted? That sounds pretty significant.
It does. He said it stabilized that front line and blunted the momentum of Moscow's summer offensive. But more than that, he claimed Ukrainian troops are, quote, not only defending, but also reclaiming ground using active defense tactics.
Reclaiming ground. Wow.
Yeah, he even said in certain areas, our units are liberating Ukrainian territory. So that paints a picture of Ukraine, pushing back, even if it's bit by bit in that specific area.
Okay, so that report from Syrskyi, it sounds quite hopeful, at least for the Sumy front, but how does that square with, other reports? Is the overall picture maybe a bit more complicated? Are Russian forces still gaining ground elsewhere?
That's the crucial question, right? You zoom out, and while Sumy might be stabilized, the bigger picture is definitely more nuanced. Deep State, they're an open-source intelligence group tracking the front lines. They reported Russia still took about 449 square kilometers in May.
449 in May alone.
Yeah, and that was apparently the highest monthly total in 2025. So it shows that even with halts like in Sumy, Russia is still advancing elsewhere. Their main goals, they still seem to be capturing the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk and carving out that buffer zone near Sumy and Kharkiv.
Right, pushing Ukrainian forces back from the Russian border.
Exactly. And a senior NATO official basically echoed that, saying Russia's still making steady advances in Sumy and the east with that buffer zone goal very much in mind. So halting one push doesn't mean the overall pressure is gone.
It just sounds like such a brutal war of attrition. It must be demanding incredible resources and, tragically, so many lives. What are the sources telling us about that human cost? And how are both sides even sustaining their forces?
Well, this is where it gets really grim. Ukraine's general staff put out a number, 1,018,940 troops lost by Russia since the full invasion started back in Feb 2022.
Over 1 million, that's staggering.
It is, and they claimed 1,220 casualties in just one recent day. Ukraine even alleges Russia is, afraid to admit scale of losses and trying to hide it by dumping soldiers' bodies on Ukraine. Now, that's an allegation, of course.
Of course. But what about Ukraine's side? They must be facing huge pressures, too.
Absolutely. It's crucial to see both sides. Our sources point to Ukraine facing significant manpower shortages. You read descriptions of troops being tired, struggling to set up proper defenses, sometimes ill-equipped.
Just worn down by the constant fighting.
Exactly. And to deal with it, Ukraine's had to resort to full-scale mobilization. That includes things like drafting people off the streets and lowering the conscription age. It really highlights the strain, especially for Ukraine with its smaller population pool compared to Russia.
So with these really undeniable manpower issues, Ukraine has to be thinking differently, right? Leveraging technology, maybe. What are we seeing there? How are they trying to level the playing field against Russia's numbers?
Yeah, this is where it gets quite interesting. Ukraine's gone hard on innovation and asymmetric warfare. They've really worked to strengthen their military by bringing in advanced tech, especially AI and drones. Lots and lots of drones.
We hear so much about the drones.
Because their domestic drone industry is just booming. Over 500 manufacturers, apparently. And reports suggest they're churning out something like 200,000 first-person view, or FPV, drones a month.
200,000 a month.
That's a reported number. And these FPV drones, the ones flown with the headset giving the pilot's view, they're relatively cheap, but incredibly effective at taking out much more expensive Russian equipment. That's a cost-effective asymmetry.
Can you give an example?
Well, there was Operation Spiderweb. The report said 117 drones simultaneously hit Russian airfields. They supposedly damaged or destroyed strategic bombers, the big Tu-95s and Tu-22 M3s.
Those are Russia's long-range bombers,
Yep.
right? Major assets.
Yes, exactly. Hitting those forces Russia to spread out its air defenses across its huge territory, trying to protect other high-value assets. That creates gaps elsewhere. And Ukraine's also proved new ground tech, like the Maraca ground robot for combat. So yeah, this tech-driven, asymmetric approach is absolutely key for them.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. While the battlefield grabs the headlines, wars run on money and resources. So let's look at the economic front. What have all these international sanctions actually done to Russia's ability to wage war?
Well, the initial numbers certainly look dramatic. The UK's Foreign Office, the FCDO, they estimate sanctions have cost the Russian state at least $450 billion in war funds between Feb 22 and Feb 25.
$450 billion. That's a massive figure.
It is, and that breaks down into things like roughly $148 billion in lost oil tax revenues because their Urals crude oil is selling at a bigger discount compared to Brent, the global benchmark. Plus, about $286 billion in Russian central bank reserves that are frozen in the EU and G7 countries.
Immobilized, so they can't access it.
Exactly. And add another, nearly $13 billion in lost interest on those frozen deposits. So yeah, the headline number is huge.
Okay, that's the number. But what's the reality on the ground in Russia? Are these sanctions actually crippling their long-term strategy? We hear conflicting things from inside Russia itself.
And that's where it gets really fascinating and frankly quite confusing. You see this internal tension. The head of Russia's central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, and the economy minister, Maxim Reshetnikov, they basically warned publicly that the methods Russia used to keep the economy growing during wartime are nearly exhausted.
So the top economists are worried.
Right. But then President Putin himself just dismissed these concerns, saying the economy is fine. So you have this split. Some analysts think the Russian economy is overheating too much military spending, maybe. But others, looking at, quote, large banks analysis and just observed reality, argue Russia is actually winning the economic fight.
Winning? How so?
Well, a senior NATO official, for instance, believes Russia's arms production is still strong, and they can likely finance the war until at least 2027. And we see Russia actively trying to get around sanctions. They're reviving efforts to expand LNG exports, liquefied natural gas. A tanker just docked at their Arctic LNG-2 facility, first time in months after U.S. sanctions hit it.
So they're adapting, finding workarounds.
It certainly looks that way. The sanctions are hurting, no doubt, but Russia seems to be repurposing its economy and finding ways to keep going, even expanding in some areas like energy exports where they can.
Given that resilience or adaptation, what's the feeling about new sanctions? Is the international community, especially the U.S., looking at tightening the screws further?
Well, looking at the U.S., President Trump has generally refrained from imposing new sanctions on Moscow, but the sources we looked at suggest his position might be losing supporters in the U.S. Congress.
Interesting. So Congress might push for more.
Potentially. Senator Lindsey Graham mentioned that Trump apparently told him, "It's time to move your bill," referring to potentially much tougher, draconian sanctions.
What kind of sanctions are we talking about?
The proposal Graham mentioned included things like 500% tariffs on any country that imports oil, gas, and uranium from Russia. That would hit major buyers like China and India hard, obviously, but also potentially some EU countries. It would be a massive escalation on the economic front.
Wow, 500% tariffs. That's huge. But didn't we also see something about sanctions being lifted?
Yeah, that was an interesting counterpoint. Hungary's foreign minister, Peter Szijjártó, said the U.S. actually lifted Russian sanctions that hindered the expansion of the Pax nuclear power plant in Hungary. So it shows there's maybe some flexibility or specific deal-making happening, even amidst the broader pressure. It's not monolithic.
Okay, from economics to diplomacy. How is international support for Ukraine looking after recent big meetings, like the NATO summit?
Well, looking at the NATO summit in The Hague, it seems Ukraine had more of a low-key presence this time. European leaders definitely reaffirmed their commitment, saying they'll keep supporting Ukraine.
Yeah.
But the joint declaration only mentioned Ukraine twice, which is a huge drop from 59 mentions the year before. And maybe more significantly, it did not discuss the potential for Ukraine to join the alliance.
That's a big shift from last year, isn't it?
But
didn't they say Kiev was on an irreversible path of membership then?
Exactly. So this lower profile, the lack of talk about membership, it suggests NATO is maybe recalibrating things, still supporting Ukraine, but perhaps being more cautious about explicit long-term commitments like membership, maybe due to concerns about escalation.
And what about the U.S. specifically? President Trump's stance on Ukraine aid has always been, well, closely watched and maybe a bit unpredictable.
Yeah, his influence was definitely felt. He acknowledged Putin might have ambitions beyond Ukraine, but he was pretty vague about future money and equipment. He said things like, as far as money going, we'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens. Not exactly a blank check.
No. And he also commented on Patriot air defense systems crucial for Ukraine, saying they're very hard to get, although he did say he'd make some available. It sounds like a more, maybe, pragmatic or fiscally cautious approach. But importantly, a senior NATO official did confirm that U.S. gear was still flowing to Ukraine and would not run out anytime soon.
Okay, so the taps are still on, but maybe the flow isn't guaranteed indefinitely at the same level. This brings up the whole debate about Western aid, doesn't it? The consistency, the speed. What are the criticisms we're hearing?
That's a really critical point. Ukraine has received a huge amount, nearly $500 billion of money and material from the U.S. and Europe, but there's persistent criticism that the aid has been delivered too slowly.
Too little, too late, some argue.
Or maybe just too slow to make a decisive difference at key moments. Some even argue that Western policies might have, perhaps inadvertently, prolonged the conflict rather than leading to a decisive Ukrainian victory.
That's a heavy criticism.
It is. And what's really insightful, or maybe concerning, is that some Ukrainian officials apparently feel their partners are afraid of Russia losing the war. The idea being they'd prefer Ukraine to win in such a way that Russia does not lose. It points to this incredibly complex strategic calculation everyone's making.
Afraid of what happens if Russia does lose decisively. Instability, escalation.
Exactly. How do you support Ukraine enough to defend itself, maybe even win, without triggering something much worse? It's a tough balancing act.
Given all that complexity, where do things stand with actual peace talks between Ukraine and Russia? Is there any movement at all?
Honestly, peace talks appear at a dead end. If anything, the conflict seems to be intensifying again. Russia's demands for just a ceasefire are completely uncompromising.
What are they asking for?
Basically, total capitulation from Ukraine. They want Ukraine to formally give up all the territory Russia occupies in Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. They want limits on Ukraine's military and a commitment that Ukraine will never join any foreign military alliances.
No NATO, basically.
Right. And they even demanded a Ukrainian election, potentially to replace President Zelensky. Unsurprisingly, the Ukrainian negotiators reportedly left those talks very quickly. The assessment seems to be that Russia is ultimately disinterested in meaningful ceasefire talks right now. They likely still think they can get more on the battlefield.
So, no diplomatic off-ramp in sight currently. Looking beyond the immediate conflict then, what about the bigger geopolitical picture? Are we seeing new alliances forming or hardening because of this war?
We really are. And one major development is what some analysts are calling an unholy alliance, maybe a strong term, but it points to closer ties between Russia, China, and Iran.
How is that showing itself?
We see concrete actions. Russia and China flying bombers together near Alaska. China pulling out of nuclear non-proliferation talks. North Korea is seen as all in with Russia, supplying ammunition directly. China and Iran are providing more, let's say, sideline support, weapons components, helping Russia evade sanctions, buying their oil, that kind of thing.
So a bloc forming that challenges the West.
It definitely looks like a consolidation of powers that often find themselves opposing Western interests. It gives them collective resilience and potentially extends their influence well beyond just this conflict in Ukraine.
In that really challenging global environment, what's Ukraine thinking long term? What's their vision for security after this war, whenever that might be?
Well, President Zelensky has talked about an ambition for Ukraine to become a big Israel. The idea is embedding indigenous innovation into the fabric of its national resilience. Basically, using homegrown technology and a strong defense posture for long-term security and deterrence.
Relying on themselves, essentially.
Self-reliance, innovation, technological edge. And there's even talk of a realistic possibility that Ukraine will export its military innovations abroad down the line, turning their hard-won battlefield experience into a defense industry, maybe even a revenue source.
Okay, that's a long-term vision. But what about the war now, the immediate future? Does anyone expect a major breakthrough soon?
Unfortunately, no. NATO's assessment is that they don't anticipate a strategic breakthrough by either side in the near future. They're forecasting a stressful and difficult summer, likely with continued Russian drone and missile strikes across Ukraine.
Just more grinding attrition.
That seems to be the consensus. It's described widely as a grinding war of attrition. Russia still has the advantage of a larger population and, frankly, a higher tolerance for casualties. Ukraine, as we discussed, is grappling with those manpower shortages and just sheer exhaustion among its troops. And this leads to some, well, quite difficult questions about Ukraine's longer-term future beyond just the fighting. Some analyses raise serious concerns, suggesting the future could be grim.
Grim in what way?
Predictions range from Ukraine potentially becoming a quasi-failed state, heavily dependent on aid, or even a debt slave to the West if it struggles to repay the massive amounts it's borrowing. That could mean lower living standards, maybe a population decline. And meanwhile, Russia's actively trying to Russify the territories it controls, essentially trying to erase Ukrainian culture and identity there. It paints a very stark picture of the long-term stakes.
We've covered so much ground today. From those tactical halts in Sumy and Ukraine's really impressive drone warfare, through to the messy impact of sanctions on Russia, and then this complex diplomatic dance with support and caveats all mixed together.
Indeed. It's just so clear that this conflict is shaped by really different goals and constraints for everyone involved: Russia, Ukraine, the West. And that leads to this prolonged, incredibly difficult struggle with, as we said, no obvious breakthrough on the horizon. It feels less like a quick fight and more like a long, drawn-out test of endurance.
So here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to maybe chew on. In this kind of grinding war of attrition, where both sides are facing huge challenges and international support has its own complexities, what does a win even look like for either side in the long run? And what unforeseen factors, maybe technological leaps, political shifts, something else entirely, could actually end up shifting the balance in ways we just can't predict right now? Thanks for diving deep with us.